Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are asking this question: is Ukraine losing the war? A year and a half ago, Russia was in bad shape. Moscow was struggling to resupply troops on the front lines. Its naval fleet in the Black Sea decimated. Battlefield commanders were abandoning offensive positions, troop casualty estimates as high as 500,000. But a disappointing Ukrainian counteroffensive and a 6-month delay in critical U.S. military aid gave Moscow the opportunity to rearm and regroup. In recent weeks, Russian troops have taken territory in the northeast and southeast at a faster clip than at any point during the war, and are closing in on Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. In a sign of just how badly the situation is deteriorating, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky abruptly canceled all international trips in mid-May to focus on the Russian offensive. So what comes next? Is this the beginning of the end? And what happens if U.S. Congress stalls on additional aid, or worse, fails to pass another package altogether? My guest, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. He joins me today from Estonia. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Ivo Daalder, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
Ukraine, you're in Estonia right now. That is not far from the front, as we know. But I want to start. I'll ask you about Estonia and the Baltics and where the war could go. But I want to start with Ukraine because, of course, over the last few weeks, I'm hearing increasingly very negative things from U.S. leaders, from NATO leaders, that it is getting harder and harder to constrain the dynamics of how this Russia-Ukraine war is going.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we will look back when the history of this war is written back to the last 6 months as really the last 6 months that may well become the turning point. It was always the case that the Ukrainians needed more capabilities. They needed more ammunition. They needed more air defense systems in order to defend their capabilities, and they needed more manpower. They only started working on the manpower issue a couple of months ago, and that's going very, very slow, much too slow in order to fill the slots that they need to fill to hold the line. But, you know, you can have as many men if they don't have any bullets to fire or shells to shoot. It doesn't really matter. And the United States was the linchpin and remains the linchpin of the armaments that the Ukrainians require. The rest of the world just doesn't have enough in their stockpiles. And the Congress refusing to act on the request that the president first made back in July. That's the last time he made a $13 billion request, and nothing happening until mid-April. And now it's just taken, it just takes time to get stuff to the front and get it across the border and to the units in the quantities to make it happening. And the Russians have decided they're going to take the advantage of the hole that was created. And they're trying to punch through left and right. They just have more people, they have more guns, and they, importantly, it looks like they have more and better morale, which makes them willing to do things that otherwise people aren't willing to do. At the same time, things aren't going well on the Ukrainian side. Yeah, so this is a very tough period.
Now, Ivo, the latter point surprises me a little bit. I understand why Ukrainian morale would be challenging given the lack of support and military capacity in the past months. But of course, the Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland. The Russians are not. The Russians are being sent in. They've had massive levels of casualties. Their leadership has been uneven, to be understated about it. And they're fighting for a purpose, for a war that most of them have no idea why they're there. Why do you think morale is high?
Well, it's relative, of course. Ukrainian morale in that sense is better, but it was down on the Russian side. It was negative, and for many people, it still is negative. By the way, the British Ministry of Defense estimates about 900 Russians are being killed each day. That's 30,000 a month. Those are large numbers when you think about it. It's particularly pilots and the more organized military that is there. The pilots weren't willing to fly because they were afraid of being shot down. They didn't know why they would be shot down. Now there's less air defense, so they're less likely to be shot down. And these glide bombs that we have been hearing about, these are just old World War II bombs with some modern kit that gives them wings to fly about 40 kilometers. These airplanes are now flying closer to the line. They're more willing to take risks. They actually see results. And war is about momentum. If you got it, then morale is on your side, and then the amount of territory that has been gained just in the last couple of weeks. It's about 100 square kilometers within a week or 10 days. That's about as much as they would gain in 2 or 3 months of fighting. So you see movement, you see things moving forward. That makes you feel better. And if you're on the other side, you're just running back constantly. That's going to have an impact on morale. And morale matters because these are drenching fights. These are hard on the people who are there. And yes, you're fighting for your country, but you're really fighting just to live another day. And that is hard enough as it is. So I just think it adds up to a dark picture. It doesn't mean the war is going to be over. We still don't think that the Russians have a sufficient number of offensive capabilities to really either break through or make a breakthrough. But can they get close enough to Kharkiv to level it in the way they did Mariupol or Aleppo, in Syria? Yeah, we may be in a few months face another Mariupol, which is a city level.
And Kharkiv is a lot bigger. Kharkiv is a lot bigger in the northeast of the country.
That's right. It's the second largest city in Ukraine, and that too has an impact. So I do think we are facing...
And then we'd be talking about millions of additional refugees, right? I mean, just to be clear. Right?
Millions of additional refugees who, can they go to Kyiv? No, because Kyiv is also being attacked from the air. Unless we rush more air defenses in to start defending these cities against the ballistic missile attacks, against the drone attacks, the level of destruction has gone up significantly. But 80% of the power generating capacity inside Ukraine has now been destroyed. It's a dire situation, and it really, I think, means we need to have a debate. We need to start having a conversation about how serious is this, and are we going to accept this? We've been saying for 2 years we will do everything we can to allow Ukraine to defend itself. We've also said that it is our strategic interest that Russia not succeed. Well, it's succeeding, and so that can't be in our strategic interest. And as a result, what are we going to do about it? We have military power. We have capabilities we could send in larger quantities. We have, troops, and I'm in the Baltic states right now. That's what they're talking about. Maybe we should thinking about relieving some of the forces in the West by deploying and training sites over there and doing other things in order for the Ukrainians to continue to fight in the East.
I want to get to the question of troops in a second, but I mean, first, let's even assume, and you're right, a lot of land has been taken by the Russians in context, a lot of momentum over the past just couple of weeks, both in the northeast of the country as well as on the front lines in the southeast. But even with the additional troops, even with the additional ammunition and firepower, what I hear is not available and will not be available because it just doesn't exist and the production capacity doesn't exist, are the air defenses. In other words, if the Russians are intent on continuing to bomb, as we've seen, destroying power capabilities, but possibly also starting to terrorize to a much greater degree all of the urban centers around Ukraine, the ability of the Ukrainians to stop them, of the West to help the Ukrainians to stop them, does not exist. Is that an accurate assessment, Ivo?
Well, it doesn't exist, except it does. It's a question of how much of the capabilities that the West have, particularly the United States, but other countries too, need to be held back for other reasons. I mean, one of the reasons we're not shipping as much as we can is because we want to keep some of it for ourselves in case there's a conflict in China or around Taiwan. Of course, now in the Middle East, with the active fighting that is going on and the possibility that has now existed for 7 months that this war in Gaza might spread, it means that the Patriot systems that we have in large quantities, they're stuck in Iraq, in Syria, protecting in Jordan, protecting our troops, and air bases and naval bases in the Gulf. All of those capabilities are stuck. They can't be moved. The same is true for the Germans, who are making a very active effort to try to get more air defense systems from countries around the world. The Germans have now sent another Patriot system. They have 12. They've sent 3, which means there's still 9 around. Now, but if you're a German military planner, you say, okay, how likely is it that I will need some of those forces in case the war does spread? You don't want to leave your own forces naked. However, and I think this is the debate we need to have, can we afford not to succeed in Ukraine? And in fact, if we don't succeed in Ukraine, what does that mean for the security of NATO writ large when you will have to deploy all the Patriot systems? Same is true for the United States. Yes, we have forces that are exposed in Iraq and in Syria and in other places, but do they need to be there? Do they need to be exposed if the consequence of that is that ATACMS or other Army forces and missile and long-range rocket capabilities, as well as air defenses, are occupied and can't be used somewhere else? These are the kinds of strategic decisions that, frankly, no one has been wanting to have that discussion, but I think we're getting to a point where it's necessary, because failure is not an option, as they say. It's not an option for the Ukrainians, but it's not an option for NATO, and it's not an option for us. Failing in Ukraine is a failure of NATO. It's a failure of the United States that will have huge repercussions for our security in the long run. That's kind of what's been lost in this debate about whether or not we're going to send $60 billion to Ukraine. In the meantime, things have gone really bad.
So, Ivo, I mean, on the one hand, from a personal, from a human, from a values perspective, I agree with everything you just had to say. Analytically, I want to push back. The idea that failure isn't an option, I mean, my understanding of what happened in NATO when the Russians invaded back in February 2022 is that they expected that Ukraine would fall. They expected to fail. They expected that Zelensky was going to have to get out of Dodge. They offered him a ride out. And if Zelensky had been more like Ashraf Ghani as Afghanistan was falling, he would have gotten on a plane, and failure would be what we're talking about right now. So, I mean, clearly from the perspective of the leaders of NATO, they've been thinking about failure as a reality, irrespective of whether or not they believed that there would be problems long term that would be harder for them to manage. Short term, failure to me has seemed like it's been an option all the way along. Am I wrong?
Well, no, you're not wrong, but time does matter. It's one thing to say in February of 2022, okay, we're going to lose Ukraine, but now we're going to invest everything we have in defending every inch of NATO territory. And that would mean that you would have to redeploy significant military capability that we have not yet deployed to Ukraine, let alone to Europe. That is now stuck in the Middle East or is necessary for looking at Asia. We would have had a very different military response than we actually did, although that doesn't mean that this military response wasn't significant. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. NATO military spending went up significantly, and particularly in Europe. U.S. redeployments of forces went up significantly. But we would have had to do more if Russia had succeeded in destroying and taking over Kyiv at relatively short period of time. Now, however, after 2 years of investing in Ukraine with the kind of capabilities, we have actually put not just our credibility, but more our defense on the front lines in Ukraine. We have said, and we actually, I think, have believed that Ukraine is not just fighting for us, for them, they're fighting for us. And now, therefore, losing means that it is more likely that you will face a Russia that believes that because NATO was weak in the first instance, it can now challenge NATO in the second instance, which means you will have to do more for defending NATO. You will have to do more in terms of sending troops to the Baltic states and deploying the kind of air defense systems that we are now not willing to deploy. So I think the question really is, do you want to do it when it's too late? Or do you want to do it now? Can we be penny wise in order to say, yeah, maybe we will send half of our Patriot batteries to help Ukraine now? Because if Russia does not succeed, it also means that it won't necessarily be a threat to NATO, definitely not in the short term, and perhaps not even in the long term. And aren't we all better off if, in fact, that's how we look at it? So I do think that things change over time because of the reality of the war.
Vladimir Putin has just come back from a trip to China where he's met with Xi Jinping. These deep friends, not quite allies, but nonetheless, Putin is getting a lot of support, a lot of economic support, a lot of diplomatic cover from Xi Jinping. How much does this matter in Russia's future, the future of the war?
You know, it's critical. Without China, Russia would be in much, much deeper trouble than it is. The Chinese are providing very significant economic support, the foundation for the rebuild and the war economy that we're seeing the Russians engaged in providing the kinds of capabilities they need in order to enhance the production of tanks, of missiles, of everything that they're producing. They couldn't do it without the Chinese. And in that sense, it's absolutely critical. Now, why are the Chinese doing it? And we know why the Russians want this. Why are the Chinese doing it? The Chinese are in competition with us. They want us to lose in that competition, and Ukraine is yet one more arrow in their quiver that they're trying to shoot to make sure that the United States and the West get weak, are seen as weak by the rest of the world, and Xi Jinping ultimately is seen as the savior of those who can stand up against the United States.
You are now in Estonia. And as the Russians make gains in Ukraine, Estonia certainly feels like a place on the front lines. Estonia has spent a meaningful piece of their GDP in support of Ukraine, and they also put about double into defense of what the average NATO member does. What's the mood on this issue in Estonia right now? How much panic is there? What are they doing about it? And is there? Give us a little sense.
Yeah, I mean, the mood is, it's not like you're walking around downtown in the beautiful Tallinn city and you see people preparing sandbags and for an invasion coming around tomorrow. The mood in that sense is completely normal. It's gorgeous weather here. People sitting outside, they're enjoying themselves. There are lots of tourists who come here with cruise ships, etc. So in that sense, you don't have a panic. But you talk to officials in the government, and they are worried. They're worried because clearly the Russians have now decided that their survival, and certainly Putin's survival, depends on the permanent mobilization of the country for war. The economy is moving into a war economy. It's becoming increasingly dependent in order to grow on churning out missiles and airplanes and artillery and bullets and tanks, etc., rather than cars. That just means that a lot of this stuff is going to be sitting around that they will want to use. And there is this worry, there's a very big worry, that if things don't go well in Ukraine, then that threat just is transported to the border of Estonia, which borders on Russia. I'm in Tallinn. I'm a few kilometers away from the Russian border. These are places that know there is a Russian threat. They also know, what it means to be part of a Russian empire. They were incorporated into the Soviet Union for 50 years. It reminds me of something that Radek Sikorsky, a good friend of yours and mine, said when I was last in Munich. Polish foreign minister, he said, 15 years ago, we told you the Russians were coming and you didn't believe us. 10 years ago, we told they were coming and didn't you believe in us. 5 years ago, we told you they were coming and you didn't believe in us. You need to believe us now. And that sentiment is very much the sentiment here. You cannot believe that Vladimir Putin and this Russia is not ultimately going to find a way to try and weaken the West by dividing it and, if necessary, using military force to that end. And so Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland, the countries on the front line, are saying, you, the United States, you, Germany, you need to wake up. This war that you don't want to fight, it's right here, right now, being fought in Ukraine.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com. And from our friends at Foreign Policy, each week on Foreign Policy Live, Editor-in-Chief Ravi Agrawal sits down with world leaders and policy experts to discuss the issues that matter most, from the U.S.-China relationship and the Israel-Hamas war to the Global South's growing clout. Listen and follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We have the most important NATO summit in this organization's history coming up in Washington, D.C. in just a couple of months in July. I certainly expect that Zelensky will either be there in person or will be dialing in, depending on the nature of the war. But it is going to be a hard summit to hold, given what you and I have just been talking about and how this Ukrainian war is going. What needs to happen at this summit? What can possibly happen at this summit to try to either turn things around or try to stabilize the situation at the very least?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, this is a summit supposedly to celebrate the 75th anniversary of NATO. And in fact, NATO officials are still talking about the celebration that they will have. And indeed, NATO has been revived. It's stronger. It's more capable. But Ukraine is going to be the dominant headline. It reminds me of the last time NATO had a summit in Washington. It was the 50th anniversary in 1999 when we were engaged in a war in Kosovo. And everybody came together thinking we're going to celebrate the fact that Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary have become members of NATO. And in fact, what we did is having a really serious discussion how to make sure that we weren't going to lose a war against Serbia in Kosovo. And it led to a discussion and ultimately a decision to start planning for a possible ground invasion of Kosovo, and it was that signal that led the Russians finally to get serious about possibly negotiating an end to the war, which happened. And so I think that's what we're going to be talking about. I think we're going to see leaders, like we saw Tony Blair in 1999, coming from Europe, deeply, deeply concerned about what's happening. We will hear it from Zelensky. I hope we'll do it before the summit and do it quietly with the message that NATO's future depends on how we react now. And the reactions now need to be including the kinds of things we haven't been willing to do. It means that we need to send them the weapons that they need, the Ukrainians need, in order to strike the Russians, not just on the front line and behind the tree lines, but deep, to go after the logistical structures in Crimea, the railway, the bridge across the Kerch, and if necessary, strike targets in Russia. The Russians are using every day missiles, airplanes, ships, and firing drones and missiles at cities throughout Ukraine. And we're telling them, you can't use our weapons to strike back. That is crazy. We need to be allowing them to fight the war in the way they need to fight it. The Germans should send them with the Taurus missile, which is a long-range missile, which would be capable of taking down the Kerch Bridge, which would make Crimea much more difficult to defend. And after all, that's what this is about. It's taking the war back against the Russians. And then we probably have to have a discussion about, is there more things we can do directly to influence this war? For example, could we deploy our air defense systems around the periphery of Ukraine in order to protect parts of Western Ukraine against the kinds of attacks that we have been seeing, so that the Ukrainians can move their air defense systems more forward to Kharkiv and defend that?
Now that's directly fighting, right? I mean, that's NATO directly involving itself in the war.
It is directly shooting down stuff that is being shot by the Russians. But it is also, you're also that missile may in fact not hit Lviv. It may hit Poland, and therefore you need to defend Poland. But yes, we have to think seriously about what steps we can take to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose this war and ultimately, in fact, gets to a situation where Russia will look back and said, this wasn't worth it, because that is ultimately what this is about.
What I hear is that this war is not going well, and that the only way that NATO is going to turn it around is if there is a willingness to risk a certain level of greater escalation. That's what I'm hearing from you.
That's right. And I think, we've seen from the very beginning a balance between the fear of escalation on the one hand and faith in deterrence on the other hand. And that balance has shifted consistently. There are things we weren't willing to do because we were fearing escalation that we have learned we could do, whether we're sending them HIMARS or now, just recently, ATACMS, or in July, F-16s, longer range weapons, more and more capable of killing hundreds and thousands of Russians, because these are Western weapons that are killing Russians on the battlefield, in the belief that we weren't going to do it because that would be escalatory. And then we said, no, actually, we can do it because the Russians' response is to escalate in a way that we can deter. And I think we need to push that faith in deterrence a little further. What is it that the Russians can do? They're really going to go to war against Europe or NATO in response? They're going to use nuclear weapons, knowing full well that we would respond significantly, not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons, and that the one thing that the Chinese have told them about this war not to do is to use nuclear weapons. So we need to recalibrate. And recalibration is something that is hard to do. And, you and I are not sitting in the Oval Office. We don't have to make those decisions. I don't envy anybody making those decisions. But these are the kinds of debates that we need to have.
And now on Trump. U.S. elections coming up real soon. And former President Trump has said repeatedly, if he wins, the war is over in a day. The Europeans are very concerned about what that might mean for their security. How much of a vulnerability do you think there is in this war on the basis of the U.S. elections?
I think there's a huge vulnerability. Trump has said that he's going to end the war in 24 hours, and the way he's going to do it, he's going to tell the Ukrainians no more aid. He's going to tell Vladimir Putin, you keep what you have, but don't take anything else. I think the problem is neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians are going to listen to him. But the Europeans will listen. And in Europe, and it's been now pretty clear for the last few months, they feel themselves squeezed between Putin and Trump. Trump, as a country that is no longer willing and able reliably to help Europe in its own defense in the way it has done for 75 years, and Putin because it is a war economy that is bent on conquest and using war as a means to divide the West. And they're increasingly thinking about how can we ourselves, 450 million people with a strong economy, figuring out how we can stand alone in a world that is beset by an unreliable and uncertain ally in the United States and an increasingly threatened militarily expansionist Russia. That's the question Europe faces. It isn't going away with this election.
So final point, Ivo, I mean, we've talked a lot about the war, a lot about the implications for different actors. We haven't talked about negotiations. Now, that is in part because no negotiations are happening. No negotiations are likely to happen. There's no overlap between what the Russians would and the Ukrainians would accept, at least not for the foreseeable future. But it does seem to me that the end of this war is likely, overwhelmingly likely, to end with, it does seem to me the end of this war is overwhelmingly likely to involve Ukraine losing territory, overwhelmingly likely to lead to some form of partition, however unacceptable that sounds and seems to us as human beings. And I wonder if you accept that.
So I don't. There will be a period in which there is neither fighting nor complete Ukrainian control of all the territory. And I do think that this war that the fighting at some point will stop, well short of Ukraine regaining all of the territory that it has lost. But that doesn't end the war, nor does it end the conflict. I think the conflict is going to be there a long time. In some ways, the conflict has been going on for not just years, but decades and centuries. As long as Russia believes that its security depends fundamentally on the insecurity of its neighbors, we're going to have a conflict. And Russians have believed that for 300-400 years. And until they actually realize that their security depends on the security of their neighbors, that if neighbors are secure, they will be secure, until that time, we will have conflict and war. And I think, therefore, when we talk about this war will end in a negotiation, what we're talking about is the end. It will more likely end in a stalemate, in some form of ceasefire, and perhaps even an armistice, but not in an end of the war or an end of the conflict per se. Just think Korea, or even better example, Syria and Israel. They haven't been fighting directly since 1975 in the War of Attrition, and Israel has now annexed the Golan Heights, but there's no peace. There's not even an agreement about who owns what territory. There's occupation in that sense, as far as the international community is concerned, of the Golan Heights, and yet there's no fighting direct between the two belligerent parties, but there's no peace. I think that's the more likely way in which this conflict will evolve, and there will be a determination for the Ukrainians to get it all back, just as there was for the Estonians who are where I am right now to get their country back, which ultimately, after 50 years, they did.
They did. Two different ways of talking about where we're heading. Ivo Daalder, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, as always.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.